Hey everyone, so today we're going to peel back the layers on something we think we know, our own societies. We're going to look past the big, flashy national statistics and go searching for a truer picture of the world by finding the hidden groups that really define how life is lived. All right, let's get into it. So let me just start by asking you this. When you see a headline about a country's GDP, does that number really tell you anything about the day-to-day lives of the people there? I think we all kind of feel like the answer is no, but just how deep that no goes is where things get really, really interesting. And this quote, man, it just nails it. What it's saying is that the biggest differences in how people live aren't between, say, someone in America and someone in Germany. The wildest, most dramatic differences are often between two people living in the same city. To see that, we just have to stop looking at maps and start looking through different lenses. Okay, so let's put on that first lens, culture. We're going to start by forgetting about passports for a second and instead group people by shared cultural habits. And when you do that, wow, some fascinating patterns just snap into focus. Take a look at this. It just cuts right through the noise. If we group together countries with an East Asian high-pressure work culture, you see people working hundreds more hours a year. And that pressure on kids, huge. But then look at what we can call Francophone social Europe, places like France. Taking nearly a month of vacation isn't a luxury, it's just normal. These are totally different ways of life, completely invisible if you only look at country-by-country data. Or how about this one, social trust? In Nordic countries, you have this incredibly high trust in strangers. And guess what? You also have incredibly high tax compliance. People trust the system. But in Southern European cultures, the trust is placed much more in the family as the core safety net. You can literally see that in how many adults live with their parents. It's just two completely different social contracts playing out. All right, so let's switch to our next lens. This one goes deeper than culture. It gets to a really fundamental divide that cuts across pretty much every society. And it all boils down to a single question. Are you protected from the system's failures, or are you the one who has to absorb the shock? So you basically have these two groups living side by side. The system adjacent, their income is pretty stable, they go to the bank when they choose to, but then you have the system exposed. Their income is all over the place. Their contact with institutions isn't a choice, it's mandatory, and it's often painful. You know, these two people can be neighbors, but they are living in completely different worlds. And this is so, so crucial. The real weight on the system exposed is made of things we never, ever track. We don't have a national statistic for how much of a family's income gets eaten by late fees. We don't measure the hours people lose waiting in lines, filling out forms. And we definitely don't track how often a tiny mistake by a big institution becomes a life-destroying crisis for an individual. This stuff is the dark matter of our economy. Yeah, this quote just says it all, doesn't it? Maybe the real divide in our world isn't left versus right. Maybe it's just who has enough of a cushion to handle a crisis and who is the cushion for everyone else. But here's where we need to pause. Because everything we've talked about so far, this whole attempt to find hidden groups, has a massive gaping blind spot. It's missing the most structurally important group of all. And that blind spot is the erasure of indigenous peoples. Now, this isn't just an accident, like someone forgot to check a box. The source material argues it's a symptom of what it calls colonial cognition. Think of it as the default setting for our modern systems, a way of seeing the world that just automatically renders entire nations invisible because they don't fit neatly inside the state's borders. And to really get this, we have to understand this quote. Colonialism isn't some dusty chapter in a history book. It's an active, ongoing process. A process that is baked into the very way we collect data, the very way we define who counts and who doesn't. Because when you actually force yourself to look, you see things that challenge the whole system. These aren't just another minority group. They are pre-existing nations. They are forced to absorb the absolute worst shocks of our modern world, from climate change to pollution. And just the act of surviving, of keeping a language alive, is a form of labor that no one ever measures. And you can see why they're erased from the data, right? Their reality is deeply inconvenient to the status quo. Okay, keeping that idea of erasure in mind is so important because it helps us see other invisible groups too. For our final layer, let's look at the new dividing lines being drawn right now by technology and modern work, lines that are creating new groups that are just as invisible to our old ways of measuring things. First up, let's talk about the temporally precariat. This isn't about being poor in money, it's about being poor in time.
Think about just-in-time scheduling. If you don't know when you're working next week, how can you make a doctor's appointment? How can you plan childcare? How can you invest in your own future? You can't. It's an incredibly effective and totally divisible tool of social control.
And you can actually measure this. Think about your own life. How many hours are you just spending recovering from work versus building something? Can you plan something for sure a week from now? How much of your life is just spent waiting, on hold, in a line, in limbo? These are the real vital signs of modern life.
And finally, we've got the digitally dispossessed. This goes way beyond the old idea of the digital divide. This isn't about who has a smartphone. It's about who has control over their own data. For this massive group of people, every click, every location check-in, every online conversation is just raw material being harvested by huge platforms. They don't own their digital lives. They are the product. So, we've looked through all these layers, from culture to who absorbs shock to these new digital divides. What's the one thread that connects all of these hidden groups? What's the big takeaway here? It really comes down to this. Our society is obsessed with tracking the things on the left: growth, speed, productivity. But we completely and systematically ignore what's on the right. We don't measure the friction in people's lives. We don't measure their ability to take a hit, their resilience, or maybe most importantly, their dignity.
And that's the bottom line, isn't it? Our data is never neutral. It is never a perfect reflection of reality. It's a choice. It's a choice about what we've decided is important. And by doing that, it's a choice about who we've decided is important.
So I'll just leave you with this to think about. If we changed what we measured, if our national dashboard started tracking things like resilience instead of just growth, or dignity instead of just efficiency, what would we be forced to see about our world? And what would we be forced to change?
Okay, so I want you to picture two people. Person A is a software architect, lives in a nice condo downtown Toronto. Person B is a mechanic, lives in a rural town, maybe, 2 hours away? Same province, they share a flag, a currency, they vote in the same elections.
But the whole premise of the research we're digging into today, it suggests they might as well be living on different planets.
Right, and here's the kicker. The thing that really hooked me is that the software architect in Toronto, they probably have more in common with a peer in London or Sydney or even Berlin than they do with that mechanic just down the highway.
It's a bold claim, but the data seems to back it up. We're all trained to look at the world like a coloring map. Canada is red, the U.S. is blue.
Yeah.
But this stack of sources argues that, well, countries are almost always the wrong unit of analysis. When you look at national averages, you just flatten reality. Yeah. You hide the actual layers of human experience.
So that's what we're doing today. We are throwing out the political map. We're going to try and redraw the world based on how people actually live. We're talking about these civilizations that overlap, invisible class divides.
And some of the massive blind spots in our data, especially when it comes to indigenous populations.
Exactly.
And then we'll get into the more future-facing stuff.
Wow.
How technology and what some call time poverty are creating new castes that have almost nothing to do with your bank balance.
So let's start with that first layer, these cultural clusters. The sources suggest that if you ignore borders and just look at values, at behaviors, the world, it sort of rearranges itself.
It really does. And the most striking one for me is always the Nordic Trust Belt. So Sweden, Norway, Denmark, parts of Finland, everyone knows, high taxes, good health care. But the engine underneath all that isn't really socialism. It's trust.
The stats here were, they're honestly hard to believe. You have something like 60 to 70% of people in these regions agreeing with the statement, most people can be trusted.
Which is huge. Compare that to the global average, which is usually, well below 30%. In a high trust environment, all your transaction costs just plummet. You don't need 12 lawyers for a contract. You don't need complex surveillance to make sure people pay for a bus ticket.
Which brings us to the wildest number.
The tax compliance, 85 to 95%.
That feels so counterintuitive. You'd think higher taxes would make people want to cheat more.
Only if you see the state as an adversary, right? In that Nordic cluster, the state is more like a collective insurance policy. You pay in because you trust the money won't just vanish into corruption. It's a virtuous cycle.
High trust makes a high-functioning state possible.
Which then reinforces the trust. Exactly.
Okay, now let's contrast that with the second cluster the research identified, the Southern European Catholic Belt. Italy, Spain, Portugal. The dynamic there is, well, it's totally inverted.
Completely. If the Nordic model is trust the state, the Southern model is trust the family. The defining statistic here is family co-residence. You've got huge percentages. We're talking 60 to 80% of adults in their late 20s, even 30s, still living with their parents.
And I think the standard economic take on that is usually pretty negative, right? You hear phrases like failure to launch.
Which is a very sort of Anglo-centric way to look at it. The sources argue this isn't a failure, it's just a different kind of social security. In these cultures, the family is what absorbs the economic shocks. Youth unemployment is tolerated because the family unit is the safety net, not the government.
Ah, so that explains the pension spending.
It explains why pension spending is often double that of the Nordic bloc. The grandparents are basically funding the grandkids' lives.
So it's not dysfunction, it's just a different distribution mechanism.
Precisely. A different civilization with different rules.
Yeah.
And then you can swing over to East Asia, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and you hit what the authors call the high-pressure efficiency cultures.
Oh, the numbers here just made me feel tired reading them. Annual work hours are between 1,900 and 2,100. For context, Germany is around 350.
It's an incredibly intense environment. You have, 70 to 80% of students in private tutoring after school. But the metric that really matters here isn't the test scores.
It's sleep.
It's sleep. Sleep deprivation as a cultural trait. It's endemic. 35 to 40% of the population reports getting insufficient sleep.
It's treated like a resource you can just trade for productivity.
Yeah, it's a badge of honor and a public health crisis all at once.
But let's bring this back home, back to the West, because there is a split in the notes that I think explains so much of the political chaos we see in the US, the UK, even here.
You mean the Anglo-settler progressives versus the Western populist hinterlands?
Yes. This is the divide that explains why our Toronto software architect has more in common with a Londoner. The progressive zones, think British Columbia, New Zealand, urban California, they prioritize environmental policy, social fluidity.
And they're comfortable with government intervention. But then you have the hinterlands. Rural America, the north of England, rural France. The defining metric there is something called geographic resentment. It's a measurable sociological feeling of being left behind by urban elites.
It's about where value comes from.
That's the friction point. The urban core thinks value comes from services, from tech, from ideas. The hinterland believes value comes from stuff, from resources, farming, mining.
So when the city says we need a climate policy, the hinterland just hears we want to kill the industry that puts food on your table.
Exactly. It's not just a disagreement on policy. It's two different realities clashing over what even generates wealth. One side sees a carbon tax as survival, the other sees it as theft.
Which explains why these arguments feel so impossible to resolve. They aren't even speaking the same language. Okay, so we've looked at geography, but the research takes a turn here that I found even more compelling. The idea that you can be in the same city, same zip code, but live in a completely different class civilization.
Right, this is the concept of being system adjacent versus system exposed.
This framework really clarifies so much. So, system adjacent first. This is probably a lot of people listening to our deep dive.
It likely is. If you're system adjacent, you have stable credentials, a degree, a trade license, your income is pretty predictable. And when you interact with institutions, a bank, a doctor, you usually do it by choice.
And the institution generally works for you. You walk into a bank, they want your business, they offer you coffee.
Right. Now you flip that to the system exposed. These are people with volatile incomes, gig work, shift work. Their contact with institutions is almost always mandatory.
Unpunitive.
And usually punitive. We're talking policing, debt collection, welfare eligibility hearings, eviction courts. They don't use the system happens to them.
And there's this metric the authors introduced called transactional friction. Can you break that down?
Think of it as the tax on being poor, but it's measured in effort, not just money. How many hours a month do you spend on hold? How many forms do you have to fill out to keep your benefits? How many late fees do you pay because you didn't have the minimum balance?
The time cost of bureaucracy.
Yes, two people can live on the same street. Person A spends 0 hours a month fighting bureaucracy. Person B spends 20. They're neighbors, technically, but they're in entirely different cognitive worlds. One is frictionless, the other is like walking through mud.
It just drives home that time itself isn't distributed equally. And that leads to this specific demographic the sources called out, the intergenerational load bearers.
This is the sandwich generation on steroids. It's not just about caring for kids and aging parents. It's about carrying the debt for both generations.
Housing for the kids, medical for the parents, plus your own student loans.
And the phrase that stuck out was sleep fragmentation.
That's the biological cost of it all.
It is. And the data shows a direct link between this group and political volatility. But here's the twist. They're too exhausted to riot. They don't revolt, they just burn out. They stop participating because they physically cannot spare the energy.
That's a terrifying thought, that the stability of our economy relies on a group of people who are just slowly collapsing behind closed doors.
It is.
And-
But we have to pivot here because about halfway through the material, there was this major correction. A critique came up that basically said, everything you've just discussed, it's still operating inside a colonial default.
This was the section on indigenous populations. We're talking about countries and classes, but we've completely missed the people who were here first. The source called it colonial cognition.
It's a really powerful term. Colonial cognition means even when we try to be nuanced with our data, we default to groups that are legible to the state. Taxpayers, voters, homeowners. We miss the people whose defining feature is that the state was literally built on top of them.
The source described them as pre-state nations living inside imposed states. That framing, it just changes your whole perspective.
It changes the whole baseline. If you view them that way, you realize the harm they face isn't some legacy event. It's not just history. It's an active, ongoing structural suppression.
And there were some brutal hidden data points here. One was jurisdictional denial.
That's a huge one in places like Canada and the U.S. You have these gaps, say, in healthcare or policing, where the federal government says that's a state problem and the state says, no, that's federal. And in that gap, the indigenous person gets no service at all.
Or administrative disappearance, just being miscounted or lumped into another category so you don't even exist in the data to begin with.
But the deepest point for me was about epistemic suppression. This is about how we know things. The modern state runs on, what, a 4-year election cycle? A quarterly budget? Indigenous frameworks often operate on a 7-generation timeline.
So when an indigenous community says, we can't build this pipeline because of what it will do to the water in 100 years, the state's spreadsheet literally cannot compute that.
Exactly. The system just rejects the data as invalid because the time frame is too long. It's a clash of civilizations over the very concept of time.
And that leads to this metric of survival as labor.
This is the one that really hurts to think about. If you're part of the dominant culture, your culture is maintained for you. It's on TV, in schools, it's the default. If you're indigenous, you have to spend unpaid hours and energy just maintaining your language, your ceremonies, your connection to land.
Yeah.
Because the environment isn't actively trying to erode it.
That is labor. It's work. But GDP counts none of it.
It's invisible work. It's resistance. And until we measure that cost, we're not seeing the whole picture of the economy.
Speaking of things the economy struggles to measure, let's look at the future. The source has mapped out these new divides being created right now by technology and by time.
This is where we get into the digitally dispossessed versus the digitally sovereign.
And this isn't just about the old digital divide, like who has fast Wi-Fi.
No, that's 2010 thinking. This is about data autonomy. Who owns your digital footprint? Are you the customer or are you the raw material being sold?
The term algorithmic visibility came up. It sounds technical, but the implication is pretty stark.
Think about applying for a loan or a job. These decisions are increasingly automated. If the algorithm doesn't recognize your data pattern, maybe you have a thin credit file or an unusual job history, you're just invisible. You can't get the service.
But on the flip side, if you step out of line, the surveillance density is incredibly high.
That's the trap. If you're poor or marginalized, the system might not see you to help you, but it sure as hell sees you to police you.
Which connects right to AI. The source has made this distinction between people who get augmented by AI and people who get optimized by it.
That is the key class divide of the next decade. You have to ask yourself, is AI a tool that you use to work faster? Or is AI the boss measuring your keystrokes, your eye movements, and your time in the bathroom?
Cognitive insulation versus embodied labor.
Right. If you have cognitive insulation, like our software architect from the beginning, you use the tech. If you're in embodied labor warehouse work, delivery driving the tech uses you. It optimizes you until you break.
And that pressure creates what the source is called the temporally precariat. We're back to time poverty, but in a new way.
Time is a currency. We usually think of poverty as a lack of money, but it's also a lack of control over your time. And the hidden metric here is schedule predictability. Can you plan more than 72 hours ahead?
If you're a gig worker on an on-call shift, the answer is probably no. You're just waiting for the app to ping.
And if you can't plan 72 hours ahead, think about what you lose. You can't organize a union, you can't join political movement, you can't promise your kid you'll be at their soccer game. You're trapped in the now. It destroys civic capacity.
And there was one other form of entrapment mentioned, the geographically trapped. We talk about globalization like the whole world is fluid, but that's not true for everyone.
We need to look at the exit option index, or basically passport privilege. The ability to just leave if things get bad, politically, economically, environmentally, that is a massive form of wealth. If you have a second passport or enough money to buy a golden visa, you have insurance against state failure.
And if you don't,
You're stuck. You have to absorb the consequences of bad policy. Again, it always comes down to who absorbs the shock.
I want to land on the final segment of the research, which I found surprisingly hopeful, or at least it gave me a new vocabulary for what I value, the moral economy. Specifically, this distinction between meaning producers and meaning extractors.
This is the quiet moral battle at the heart of our economies, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
So on one side, you have meaning producers, teachers, nurses, care workers, plumbers, artists, the community glue.
And on the other side, meaning extractors, rent seekers, arbitrage layers, people whose job is just to stand between value and the person who needs it and take a toll.
The text had a great example of this with how we calculate GDP.
It did. A confusing tax system actually adds to GDP because you have to hire accountants to navigate it. But a teacher who stays late to help a struggling kid.
Invisible to the economy. Zero GDP.
In fact, it's worse than invisible. The system penalizes it because it's seen as inefficient.
Exactly. GDP loves extraction. If you break a window, GDP goes up because you pay someone to fix it. If you build a neighborhood where people trust each other and don't need security guards, GDP stays flat.
And the metric the sources proposed here is social repair capacity.
Right.
Every society needs maintenance. It needs care. When the ratio tips too far toward extraction, when you have more people trading the wheat than growing it, society just hollows out. It becomes brittle.
It's like a house with termites.
Mhm.
The structure looks fine from the outside, but the load-bearing beams, the meaning producers, are being eaten away.
And that leads us to the ultimate conclusion of this deep dive, really.
So if we step back and look at the whole map we've drawn today, trust clusters, friction, time poverty, extraction, what's the through line?
Well, if we synthesize all this, the meta pattern is about what we choose to measure. Right now, our dashboards, the way we run the world, they track velocity and growth. We are obsessed with speed and size, but we completely ignore things like friction, vulnerability, and impact tolerance.
So we're measuring how fast the car is going, but not how bumpy the road is for the passengers, or if the wheels are about to fall off.
Or if the passengers are even strapped in.
It really challenges the traditional left versus right debate. It feels like the real division isn't about ideology anymore.
I don't think it is.
Yeah.
The most important division is about insulation. Who has the buffers, the money, the time, the passport, the status to abstract the problems away? And who is left exposed to take the hit?
That is the question. Who absorbs the shock?
And that leaves us with a provocative thought to take away. We are drowning in data. We measure everything from our step count to global shipping lanes. But what would change if we decided to measure resilience instead of growth? What if we measured dignity instead of efficiency?
And maybe the most important question of all.
Who is doing the measuring? Because until we change who holds the ruler, the map will never show the real territory.
Something to think about next time you see a national average. Thanks for diving in with us.
Always a pleasure.